Content warning. This discussion touches on consent and power dynamics, which is obviously related to subjects like abuse, sexual assault, and grooming, although it contains very little explicit discussion of any of these in specific. If such topics might be upsetting to you, consider passing on this video, or having someone else screen it for you, whatever works for you. Take care of yourselves. Hi, I'm Ash, but you can call me Icon for short. This is going to be more of a ramble, so I don't want to bore you with the typical roundabout introduction. Today I want to talk about parenting and childhood, and some of the weird things about how people in my part of the world think about them. I live in a very individualist society, but one of the weirder things I've noticed as I look back critically on my own childhood, as well as how I see other children treated, is that most of us aren't really raised along these lines very well. There's an expectation that children are too young and inexperienced to know what to do, so parents or guardians will take care of them and make choices for them, and attempt to instill values in them. But once you turn 18, you're assumed capable of making decisions yourself, competent enough to live on your own and be employed as an adult. The thing is, I don't see a whole lot of time spent between birth and age 18 actually developing decision-making skills. Like, we've all at some point just accepted that high school is when you start making minor choices on your own, and then after high school, you're mostly on your own. We give kids 4 years to figure out an invaluable life skill that will be an integral aspect of the entire rest of their lives. Worse, though, before that, we teach them a lot of things that actively prevent them from being able to adjust to these demands well. This might not speak to everyone's experience, but most kids I know of are raised by their parents in a few specific ways. First, their parents make decisions for them. They decide if their friends can come over, where they go and when, what they wear, what they eat, when they sleep, etc. Second, many parents place restrictions and rules that they don't explain to the child, like what they're allowed to do for fun, how to behave around other people, what words they're allowed to use, what ideas are inappropriate to express or discuss, etc. Third, a lot of parents don't engage their children in a lot of the decisions being made. Sometimes this is an authoritarian parent who says, "Do it because I said so," but sometimes it's a bit more subtle, like parents not asking kids what they'd prefer to eat for dinner, what clothes they'd prefer to wear, what the rules in the house should be. All of this sounds pretty normal to me, like this is a pretty standard set of dynamics between parents and children in my mind. The weird thing is, all of these things fundamentally conflict with the development of decision-making skills. Other people making your decisions for you means that you don't learn how or why choices are made. You don't learn to weigh pros and cons, to evaluate outcomes, to even consider outcomes or consequences, or to consider your own preferences. Why should you think about what you want or how to get it or what comes after when nothing responds to your input? Why bother with weighing pros and cons if, at the end of it all, you have no influence over the outcome? Similarly, having to live by seemingly arbitrary rules means you aren't taught to think about fairness, about seeing other sides of issues, about the reasons why rules exist, and which ones might be good and which might be bad. If nobody explains the rules to you, why would you bother to follow them without the threat of punishment? How can you develop a respect for rules when you have been given no reason to respect them? And worst of all, when your input is never asked for, you don't learn how to give it. You don't learn how to express yourself, how to argue your case, how to respond to counterpoints, how to assert yourself, or how to do all those things relatively quickly. Is it surprising that many children prefer to speak to their peers than their parents, when their parents don't seem to care what they have to say? I took a developmental psychology course a little while ago, and part of what we learned was how teenage years can be a bit rough for people. Teens often feel like they're invincible and don't take proper precautions or consider the consequences of their actions, and thus make a lot of irresponsible decisions. Teens can conflict with their parents as they explore their newfound agency, attempting to assert their own identity and separate themselves from their parents. Teens often defy rules and expectations, showing little respect for the restrictions placed on their behavior by parents or teachers. These are all pretty well understood aspects of the teenage experience, at least in my mind. That course tended to assume that these were at least partly the result of maturation, where functions and concepts naturally develop over time as people age. I think this is a bit simplistic. Are any of the facts I listed surprising when we look at how teens have lived up until this point? Their parents have done everything for them. They haven't had to make decisions or consider long-term consequences before, so why would we expect them to feel anything less than invincible? Why would we expect them to make reasonable and responsible decisions when they've never had to evaluate anything of any importance before? How can we expect them to show any respect for rules they haven't had any say in establishing, and whose reasoning is unclear to them? I think we spend a lot of time thinking about kids protectively when they're young, which isn't a bad thing. Kids are inexperienced, uneducated, and very well could make irresponsible decisions that hurt them in the long term. What's made me rethink a lot of this approach was a talk I listened to about a model called supported decision making, which is a proposed alternative to putting disabled adults under guardianship. A lot of the things that the speaker mentioned reminded me of how we often treat kids, and what that communicates to them. Disabled adults under guardianship can lose the ability to determine who they can see, where they can live, what they can do, and what they can have. And the biggest moral and philosophical objection to this is that it fundamentally strips these people of all agency. It's not right for a disabled adult to lose all ability to make decisions in their life and place them entirely in the hands of others, because we recognize that people should have a right to agency, a right to choose. This right is often taken away under the guise of protection. The person can't make decisions completely by themselves on all matters, so elaborate hypotheticals are concocted where a disabled person makes an irresponsible or bad decision and is hurt by it. It's for their own good that we strip them of their right to choose, because what if they make a bad choice and get hurt? Most of us can recognize that this is a flawed reason to take away someone's rights, and in fact there exists no good reason to do so, but that's too substantial a tangent to go on for now. After all, don't we all, disabled and non-disabled alike, make bad choices occasionally? Don't we have the right to make mistakes and to learn from them? And don't we all usually need at least some help making at least some decisions? Supported decision-making is how we all make decisions. We ask people for help when we don't know what to do, and once they've explained it to us such that we understand, we get to make the choice ourselves. We don't sign away our rights when it comes to legal procedures or medical care just because we aren't all doctors and lawyers. We ask for help understanding the issues so that we can ultimately make the decision ourselves. I think a lot of this carries over to our understanding of parenting in childhood. We try to protect kids by doing everything for them, and obviously in the earliest years that's kind of unavoidable. We try to make sure they don't hurt themselves, and so we intervene and stand between them and the things they don't understand. The problem is that this approach doesn't prepare them well for the inevitable day when they no longer have a guardian to do that for them. I think it makes sense to consider supported decision-making in the context of parenting as well as legal guardianship, because if we want to teach our children to have respect for principles of freedom and consent, then we need to show them that we value them. People don't just learn from books and from speeches, they learn from actions. We instill values through our actions, not just what we tell our kids. If we aren't teaching them about the value of responsible decision-making through our actions as well as our textbooks, then they learn the opposite lesson. They learn that these ideals are hollow, and their decisions don't mean anything. One of the more interesting places this has repercussions, to me, is consent. What does it mean to a kid to consent to something? Well, given the environment and parenting style I've described thus far, consent would be more of a passive thing, right? Your parents are making all the decisions. Your consent isn't enthusiastic participation, it's just letting it happen. It's all going to happen anyway, the only difference is whether you fight back and how hard. But how do we want people to understand consent? How do we want adults to think about consent, broadly? Don't we want consent to be enthusiastic, an active agreement to participate? Shouldn't consent be something we win from someone rather than something we force out of them? I don't find it surprising that a lot of people in their young adulthood have a very loose and poor conception of consent, where consent is simply not hearing a no, and a lack of consent is only signaled by an active struggle. I don't just mean this in terms of sex, although its repercussions there are obviously incredibly important. I also mean in the rest of life as well. Consenting to employment, to medical care, to legal procedure. Shouldn't these be things we want people to enthusiastically agree to, rather than things they feel pressured not to fight against? Shouldn't signing an employment contract be a joyous occasion, where someone enthusiastically agrees to perform whatever labor is required of them, rather than a dull occasion where you feel powerless to do anything but agree? Shouldn't agreeing to medical care be something you do enthusiastically, assured that your decision will bring about your desired outcome, rather than something you feel powerless over? Shouldn't participation in government, in democracy, and agreement to the law be done enthusiastically, something that everyone is only too happy to engage in, rather than something we feel no ability to influence or resist? I think a lot about this kind of stuff because a common ableist idea is the infantilization of disabled people, treating them the way we might treat a child. This treatment is unfair to disabled adults, but I don't think it's a particularly fair way to treat children either. I think it's imperative we take every opportunity, at this stage of development that everyone agrees is so critical, to instill in children the values we want our society to have. Do we want them to believe that their voices don't matter? That their decisions are unimportant? That they have no influence over their lives? That their consent is something assumed rather than given? Or do we want them to value others' perspectives? To be responsible in their decision-making? To recognize the impact of their actions? To recognize consent as something that has to be earned? There's a political dimension to these questions as well. If many children aren't given a chance to develop decision-making skills, and as a result have a conception of consent as passive, think about how that might impact political action and thought for these people. In the United States, we have complex and dense laws that many of us don't understand or even know about, but we are supposed to live in a democratic society, where citizens have input on the government's decisions. This is kind of a contradiction, but it's one many people don't notice precisely because of this loose conception of consent. For them, the law isn't something they expect to have an active role in shaping, it's something they are supposed to passively accept. A lot of the time, we kind of subconsciously think of the law as something alien that's imposed on us. That's why we all recognize that the police are to be feared and avoided, because they are outsiders who impose an alien law on us. Shouldn't we want a society where we feel like we've all had input on the laws we follow, and where these laws are something we actively embrace? Shouldn't we want a society where law enforcement aren't a force to be feared, but something we can feel secure around? I think a lack of decision-making education can make questions like this difficult to even ask, and that's precisely why we should strive to ensure that people are raised to think and be active participants in decision-making. There's research that shows that when people are given a decision-making education, they are more easily able to recognize potentially abusive situations and avoid them. And that's kind of obvious, right? If you have a lot of experience making decisions, expressing preference, and controlling your life, it's much easier to recognize red flags like someone dismissing your perspective, ignoring your preferences, or disrespecting your boundaries. The reason why these red flags are more obvious is clear. Having experience controlling your life makes it easier to see when someone is trying to take that control away. I think we need to be aware of this on a broader societal level, because recognizing that many aspects of how supposedly democratic governments work are outside your control can help us be better democratic participants. I'd argue it would also extend to workplaces, centers of many people's lives where they have almost no control over anything. A lot of leftist ideals flow naturally from prioritizing decision-making, and raising kids to develop these important skills earlier in life can help them see areas where they don't have as much say as they should. There might be questions about how exactly to educate kids on decision-making, and I want to make it completely clear that I don't want people to allow their kids to make life-altering, dangerous choices the second they can string a sentence together. Kids, within most of our legal and social frameworks today, are at a severe power imbalance in the vast majority of major decisions they might make, and they should not be allowed to be taken advantage of by people with more experience and power, period. We don't let kids sign employment contracts or legal documents for exactly this reason. Decision-making is a skill, and skills are built through practice. I don't expect kids in elementary school to decide on medical care any more than I expect them to be able to write a novel. But looking into the small ways many disabled folks are able to express preference or influence their lives can be a useful guide. I bring this topic up because I've known a few kids, like my younger sisters, and one common frustration I see, which is also often portrayed in media, is that they don't feel like anyone takes them seriously. Everyone just dismisses them out of hand, ignores what they have to say, and trivializes their concerns, and I think it's fair for them to be frustrated by that. That isn't to say that their concerns are always serious, or that they always have valuable input on every topic, but I do worry that being dismissive only reinforces these ideas I've been talking about so far, at precisely the time where they need to start preparing for greater responsibility and agency. I worry about the outlets they might look for if nobody ever takes them seriously, because abusers and groomers take advantage of that way too often. Abusers and groomers give kids the impression that they're being treated like adults, and I don't think I need to go into how they might do that for everyone's sake. Just in case I need to say it again, I don't think all kids always have valuable and serious input on every conversation. That's true of all people. I just worry about the message it sends for people to almost never take them seriously. Anyway, this was a bit of a ramble. Sorry about that, folks. I've just had these thoughts on my mind a lot lately, and I thought I might as well just kind of blurt them out here. I would love to hear others' thoughts and about other experiences as well. These are necessarily complicated conversations to have, and I hope that I've provided a good springboard for productive discussion. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.